I live on a really small island near Japan, so we have a lot of Japanese tourists visiting all the time. We have this really popular beach, which is listed as one of our top 3 tourist attractions. You had to climb down some stairs as well as a ladder, and then you jump down 5 feet into the sand or water to reach the bottom. Or you could jump off the cliff straight into the water. The jump from the main cliff was about 15 to 20 feet. The thing about this beach is that when it gets really rough, the waves hit the cliff sides, and when they do, they reach astounding heights. The waves would get so big that it would reach the parking lot, which is about 35 feet away from the secondary cliffside. There was this one summer where this Japanese male, around in his mid-20s, went diving head-on into the waves while they were pretty mild. Still super dangerous, but pretty mild compared to the waves that reached the heights. Well, the next day or so, word spread that the guy had passed. The locals said that he was diving into the waves even after they advised him to stop. The guy would jump into the waves from the cliff, climb the ladder and up the stairs back to the top and jump right back in. The locals said that they saw him jump repeatedly, until he didn't. They called the police and the police arrived, but they couldn't really do much for a while, for the water was still very rough. The mist, salt in the air and sand mixed within the waves made it really hard to see. They searched for his body and they eventually found him in the waters of a nearby beach. He was headless, his body was almost split completely, and his legs were broken. They eventually came to the conclusion that the waves had pushed him against the cliff head-on so hard that his head was pushed into his body, as well as the rest of his injuries, because he was still being slammed against the cliffside for hours. There's a Japanese gravestone on the side of the beach. I always walked past it, but hadn't learnt the story until I got older. I had always thought that it was some kind of small World War II monument or something. I guess I'm not part of the cleanup crew, but I attend some of the scenes. There was an older gentleman who had died in the bath. The top half of his body was all swollen and puffy, whereas his legs and lower torso had also melted away. It essentially created this horrendous soup/casserole mix inside of the bath. The coroner had to sift through the bath to find his liver. During the post-mortem, his testicles were so swollen that they had to prick them just to drain out all of the liquid. I just really hate the smell. It seems to stick to your clothes. You come back into the office and everyone can smell it on you. Not my experience personally, but a friend of the family who is a first responder. There was a teenage couple, a boy and a girl, that were driving upwards of 100 miles per hour down a country road in Wisconsin at night. The male was driving and was wearing a seatbelt. The female was the passenger, and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The driver lost control and slammed right into a tree. Our friend arrived first on the scene and found the teenage female had been thrown through the windscreen and was in many pieces in the branches of the tree. The teenage male driver who was seatbelted in was found nearly completely decapitated from his head to his body with only a strip of neck flesh keeping his head attached. He had been driving so fast that the impact had caused his seatbelt to cut across his chest and nearly slice his head right from his body. My dad's friend is a cop who works a rural area and loves to tell my dad about all of the messed up stuff that he comes across, one of them being the time that he was sent to a call of a large group of people that were crying and coughing inside of an apartment. He eventually gets there and it's a large group of family members. They are cleaning up the shotgun suicide of a relative. That's when I learnt that it's sometimes up to the family and it's not always the people with the hazmat suits. I nearly had to clean up after I had found my dad dead back in March. He was home alone and he had had a heart attack and was dead before he hit the floor, but he broke his nose on contact since he didn't put his arms out. He bled everywhere. It went through the hardwood floor and all down the walls in the basement. It was awful. When I was in prison, we would take classes like HIV and AIDS prevention, drug and alcohol and substance abuse, etc. Well, there was this one class where guest speakers who were friends with the chaplain would come and share some pretty life-changing experiences with the group. At least, that was the idea. One morning, a guy comes in and he looks like a pretty normal dude. And he tells us that he's never been a drug addict and he's had no problems with alcohol. He had a nice family, nice job, and he was a volunteer EMT. He was tasked with cleaning up car crashes most of the time, so not crime scenes, but still some gnarly stuff. He continues on about how a routine call and he and another guy were cleaning up a serious car wreck. Someone had wrapped their truck completely around a tree. The guest speaker was cleaning blood out of the passenger side floorboards when his hand slipped in. He'd been face down right in a puddle of blood. He knew immediately that he had it in his mouth and all over his face. I think some might have even splashed in his eyes, but I forget. Anyway, absolute worst case scenario ensues. The driver was HIV positive or some kind of hepatitis, and he in turn became infected. He infected his wife, and then she leaves him, and she tells the kid in the family that the father is gay, and they harassed the crap out of this poor guy and basically all around ruined this guy's life. He finished telling the story and he stuck around and answered a few questions. Not that really many were asked, but there's no feel-good stories, no happy endings, and sometimes life just really sucks. This story took place down in the southern United States. I was interning with a forensics unit at the time, and it was my first real crime scene. This guy found out that his boyfriend was cheating on him, and then he flew into a jealous rage, stabbed the guy to death with a handle of a frying pan, chased him through the house, and then finished him off in the bathtub where he stabbed him an estimated 200 additional times. His head was a lump of pulp and bone shards. The guy that I was working with tasked me with digging bits of skull from the drain with tweezers. So yeah, it was pretty messed up. My mum used to do cleanup for a certain yellow cleaning company and was the only one certified to do Hazmat. They did cleaning for the county sheriff department, and the one that stuck with her was in the back of a cruiser where they had a meth head, as they described him. He was so tweaked out of his mind, he kept rubbing his face back and forth across the dividing glass and managed to wear his face off from ear to ear. I got to see pictures of it before cleanup. This was nearly 10 years ago and it still haunts me to this day. Not my story, personally, but my former boss's wife is a mortician, and she does death scene cleanup on the side as kind of a service for the funeral home. He said that the worst thing that they ever did was clean up after a homeless man had snuck into an industrial building, then climbed up to the top of a set of seldom used stairs and passed away. These stairs in the landings were only made up of metal grating. Maybe about 2 weeks later, somebody notices the rancid smell, opens the door to the stairwell, and finds the remains of the man that has liquefied and then dripped down 4 stories of stairs. Pretty nasty stuff. Police detective here. In a rural area, a guy had passed away in his yard. It happened around July. It was 8 days before someone found him. He was partially liquefied and there were flies everywhere, and the stench was really pretty nasty. Knowing where these flies were before they landed on your face didn't really help. I had to shovel him into a bag with gas masks, and FYI, liquefied people are quite toxic. I got caught up in a traffic jam once, caused by a motorcycle accident. It was apparently at high speed. Once we made it to the scene, there were lots of dividers and steel barriers there. I suppose he got caught up in them during the crash, and it shredded him. I knew it was pretty bad when there were dozens of yellow covers no bigger than a foot all over the road. I just remember yelling, "Don't look," and my car mates were like, "I'm not looking." I'm not a crew member, but I got told a story a couple of years back and I couldn't get a hold of my brother, so my stepmom and I drove out to make sure he was okay. He lived about 2 hours away from me and we hadn't heard from him in about 2 weeks. It wasn't really uncommon for him, as he did do a lot of drugs and he was a very solitary guy. I crawled in a window and I didn't really smell anything nasty, it just smelt like a musty old house. Anyway, I got the door open and we found him in his room. He was definitely a few weeks into decay and he was very bloated and there was blood all over the room. I didn't initially see the maggots, but from the report there was apparently maggots. Turns out they mistook a bullet in his head for maggots on the x-ray. We had to go back the next day to his house and I found his tooth in the closet door rails on the floor. After the body was removed, his hair was stuck to the carpet and there were a few maggots there as well. To deter anyone from suicide, he shot himself in the head and lived long enough to put the gun under his mattress and he laid down, waiting for death, getting blood all over his mattress. He realised that it was a mistake and he eventually got up to try and grab his phone, but he fell over to the spot where we found him. Drugs are just terrible. We found a guy dead in his apartment. He'd been there for a few weeks. We had to process the scene, including rolling him over to take pictures. Unfortunately for us, he was literally a dark green blob, and he had started to liquefy into the carpets and walls. Rolling him over was like grabbing a 320-pound ball of goo. 2 gloves on each hand, and we could still feel everything. Also, if you happen to die with your dogs in the same room and enough time passes, they will literally eat exposed skin, which is normally your face. It's just so bad. I used to do auto detailing in college for a car dealership. I was scrubbing the floor of a car and no matter what I did, the water kept turning this red tint. So I pulled the seats and found about an inch of dried, crusted blood and what I can only guess was brain matter and skull fragments. As it turned out, it was apparently a suicide car that the dealership had bought at an auction. It had been detailed before being sold, but they never pulled the seats and we called the cops to confirm. It was all logged and then we shipped the car back to the auction. The dealership lost their arse on it but wanted it as far away from their lot as possible. Search and rescue personnel here. Working in Las Vegas, we see a ton of really messed up stuff. Chances are pretty high that if we're looking for a missing person, we'll probably find an unrelated subject. The worst one was when we were deployed to find a female stuffed in a suitcase. After recovering the female in the suitcase, the coroner said that it was the wrong female and we were sent back out to find the right one. I guess I should clarify though, we are in a cleanup crew. We were often tasked with body recovery. The coroner's office does the packaging and LE does the investigation. We then solemnly carry them out. Everyone needs to come home. There's always someone out there who cares for them. Police officer here. I attended a scene where a guy went to his ex's house, walked in and then murdered her, as well as her mother and teenage son. It was clear from the scene that he had gone in with a rifle and shot the 3, but the son had attempted to crawl to a phone in the kitchen. They then went out to his car, grabbed a shotgun and then pumped a slug through each one of their heads before putting one inside of his own as well. The son was in a high school and he was well on his way to college football. His girlfriend was scheduled to also be at the house but had last-minute issues with the family illness. Thank God she wasn't able to make it. My dad used to be a coroner's assistant back in the late 70s, early 80s, and he's had some pretty messed up stories. The one that always sticks with me the most, and I think most responsible for his PTSD, was a car that was full of drunk teenagers on prom night that was struck by a train. He said that the car had ignited and he could smell them burning. They were barely able to identify them and he had to help move their cooked bodies. These kids, who were around the same age as my older brother at the time, just hearing this story alone scares the crap out of me and I will never, ever drink and drive. I worked CSI in Mexico. We once went to a safe house where the police found about 14 people who were tortured and then executed. You could actually smell the iron from the entrance, from the blood. Upon entering, there were two women with broomsticks that were taped to the anus and vagina. In the upstairs bathroom, they found a woman that was tied to the toilet who had died of dehydration and had been urinated and defecated on. It was also evident that they had raped her and beat her before turning her into a human toilet. One of the rooms had 5 shackles on the wall, and in the centre there was a metal bucket with water. The 5 people had died from hunger and beatings. The sickest was in the backyard, where there was a warehouse without any windows, and there were several bodies that had had their faces and hands removed. It was exactly like watching a horror movie, and I'll never forget it. I'm a police officer and I've been on a good number of death scenes. One that really sticks out in particular was a suspicious death on top floor maintenance stairwell of a 5-storey apartment building. I arrived and I could smell the body from the bottom floor and the lobby. How it took this long for anyone to call in, a building that was filled with hundreds of people, is beyond me. I got on the elevator and began to go up, the smell getting worse with each floor. My corporal was with me and he started to look a bit sick. The door to the 5th floor then opened and I was then hit with the smell that I will never forget. This poor man was lying face down on the top floor landing just inside the doorway to the stairwell. He had probably been there for about 2 weeks in the middle of July in the southeastern United States. The top floor was not air conditioned as it was storage and maintenance, so it was around 100 degrees inside of it. The man was bloated and leaking his juices all over the place. His skin was this really nasty black colour. The juices were leaking down the stairs, dripping into the landings of the 4th and 3rd floor. Now, this was classified as a suspicious death, so the detective had to come out and see if we could rule out homicide, just to be sure. As my corporal was currently heaving out of an open window, I had the privilege of assisting the detective with rolling this bloated corpse over in order to inspect it for wounds. When body removal finally showed up, even they were gagging. Again, I got to assist with moving the corpse onto the gurney. We had put on full body suits and masks to move him in case he burst. Luckily, he just leaked but didn't split down the middle. 0 out of 10, do not recommend.